They laughed at Mountain Man's fat bride until she removed her veil at the ceremony. The church bells of Calico Springs rang out that morning, though their sound seemed more like a cruel taunt than a holy summons. Boone Callahan, the mountain man known for his silence and his size, stood waiting at the altar. He was a man who had faced storms, wolves, and avalanches without flinching, but now every pair of eyes in the crowded church bored into him with scorn. Whispers rose like wind through dry grass. He must be desperate or blind. Imagine taking a fat bride like that. The laughter was muffled, but it carried, curling through the pews and striking at the heart of the woman who stood beside him. Lydia May, her frame hidden beneath a plain gown and a heavy veil, heard every word. Each snicker landed like a stone. Her cheeks burned, though no one could see them. For years she had known what it was to be judged by her body, but to endure it here, on the very day meant to be sacred, was almost more than she could bear. Still, she stood tall, her back straight, her hands steady. Beside her, Boone reached for her hand and held it firmly, his grip silent but defiant. His eyes swept across the congregation, daring any man to mock aloud. The minister's voice faltered under the weight of the tension, but the vows were spoken. Then came the moment, the veil. As Boone lifted the thin fabric away, gasps silenced the cruel whispers. What the townsfolk had mocked as shameful was revealed as striking. Lydia's face shone with calm dignity, her dark eyes unwavering, her beauty carrying a quiet strength that made every cruel tongue fall still. For the first time, it was the crowd, not the bride, who burned with shame. The silence in the church lingered long after the veil had been lifted. Lydia May stood before them, her head held high, refusing to shrink under the weight of their astonishment. Her figure was still broad, her gown unable to disguise the fullness of her form, but her face, calm, luminous, unflinching, shifted the mood entirely. What had moments before been cruelty and derision now seemed petty and small. Boone Callahan, who had once been little more than a rumor in town, a giant of a man who lived high in the timberline cabins, descending only when winter storms demanded supplies, straightened his shoulders with quiet pride. He had endured many things in silence, but in that moment, as he looked at the woman who was now his wife, he allowed himself the smallest smile. The townsfolk had always considered him an oddity. Some said he was half wild. Others whispered that he had blood on his hands from a past he never spoke of. But now, standing in the church, with Lydia's hand in his, he seemed less the menace they'd imagined and more the steadfast mountain man who would sooner break than bend. After the ceremony, the couple did not linger. They endured polite nods from a few, thin smiles from others, and stony silence from most. Then Boone hitched their wagon and guided it away from Calico Springs, up into the higher country where the pines whispered and the air was clean. The cabin he had built with his own hands waited there, smoke curling from its chimney, a place far removed from wagging tongues and narrow minds. For Lydia, who had spent her life under watchful, judging eyes, the solitude was not a burden, but a balm. She could breathe there. Yet the town did not release them so easily. Rumors clung like burrs. And when Ed Slater, a wiry rancher from the valley, rode up one afternoon, his face grim with warning, Lydia understood that her marriage was not the only thing under scrutiny. "The railroad's coming," Slater said, dismounting stiffly. "Surveyors were in the valley this morning. They've got their eyes on Cold Water Creek, and that runs straight through your land. His gaze flicked to Lydia, sharp and skeptical. They won't take kindly to Cherokee blood-claiming rights. You'd best be ready. Lydia's pulse quickened, but she did not flinch. She stepped forward, her voice even. This land is mine by right, and I hold the deed to prove it. My father saw to it before he died. Whatever the railroad thinks, the law will stand. Slater shook his head, unconvinced. Law bends easy when money presses hard. With that, he rode off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. That night, by the glow of firelight in the cabin, Boone studied his wife as she mended a torn shirt. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had endured mockery and loss, yet still stood unbroken. He had thought to shield her from the ugliness of the world, but now he saw she needed no shield. What she needed was a partner willing to fight beside her. And somewhere in the shadows of Calico Springs, Deputy Wade Kettering was already making his bargain with the railroad men, one that would pit him directly against the quiet strength of the mountain man and his bride. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded in the hush of the high country, where snow still lingered along the ridges and the air carried the sharp bite of pine and frost. Boone guided the wagon up narrow trails, Lydia bundled beneath furs, her eyes wide at the sheer cliffs and tumbling creeks that surrounded them. At first, the silence unnerved her. She had lived her whole life among whispers, but this was silence of another kind, vast, echoing, filled with the cries of hawks and the distant thunder of falling snow. Boone rarely spoke, his words measured and few, but his actions spoke volumes. He built fires high and warm, lifted her down from the wagon with care, and always kept his broad frame between her and the bitter wind. One night, as the storm rolled down from the mountains, Boone pulled the wagon into a stand of firs and set about building shelter. Lydia, unused to such travel, tried to help. She gathered kindling, her fingers clumsy in the cold. When she dropped the sticks in frustration, Boone said nothing. He only handed her a strip of jerky, nodding toward the fire he'd coaxed from damp wood. "Eat first," he said quietly, "warmth and strength before anything else." It was the first time she heard softness in his voice. She obeyed, and for the first time in years, she felt less like a burden and more like a partner. When they reached the cabin, Lydia expected rough walls and a dirt floor. What she found startled her. A sturdy home of hewn logs, a stone hearth, shelves neatly stacked with jars and tools. It was not grand, but it was cared for. She touched the polished wood of the table, the quilt folded at the bed's foot, and realized this man had built not just a shelter, but a life. Days settled into rhythm. Lydia rose early, sweeping the cabin, learning the sounds of the forest. She cooked with what Boone hunted and traded, stretching venison with beans, turning berries into jam. He taught her how to split kindling, showing her the right angle of the axe. When she laughed at her crooked attempts, his lips curved in the faintest smile, a crack in the stone mask he wore. At night, as the wind howled outside, they sat before the fire. Sometimes Lydia read aloud from her father's worn Bible. Sometimes Boone simply listened, his eyes half closed, as though her voice carried him somewhere far away from loss and memory. Yet shadows lingered. When she rode into town with him for supplies, the whispers returned. "There goes the fat bride," someone muttered. Others smirked, eyeing Boone as if he were a fool for choosing her. But Boone's hand never left hers. He stood tall, his silence more threatening than anger, until the whispers died away. Back in the wagon, Lydia dared a glance at him. "Why do you never answer them?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Because their words aren't worth your tears." Her throat closed with something warm, something dangerous. For the first time since her humiliation at the altar, she felt not just defended, but cherished. Still, beyond the whispers, a larger threat loomed. Railroad men were sighted again in the valley. Boone saw the survey stakes driven into the earth, bright red cloth fluttering in the wind like blood. And Lydia, gathering herbs along the creek, felt the weight of eyes on her. The railroad wanted their land, and Deputy Wade Kettering, hungry for power and coin, was preparing to strip them of everything. But as Lydia stood beside Boone at the edge of their valley, the firelight of their cabin glowing behind them, she felt no fear. She had found not only a husband, but a fortress of flesh and bone, and she was ready to fight for the life they were building together. The cabin soon became more than a shelter against the winds of Calico Springs. It became a proving ground for two lives learning to move as one. Boone rose with the dawn, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he stoked the fire before heading out to chop wood or check the traps along the ridge. Lydia, wrapped in a shawl, followed soon after, sweeping the hearth, humming softly, filling the room with the scent of coffee and biscuits. Though she had never known the rhythms of mountain life, Lydia took to them with a quiet determination. She patched torn shirts with a steady hand, learned to render fat for soap, and kept the shelves stocked with jars of beans and preserves. She even found herself laughing one evening when Boone showed her how to carry 2 buckets of water on a yoke. The bucket swayed wildly, sloshing water across her skirts, and she collapsed against the porch rail in helpless laughter. For a moment, Boone's deep voice rumbled with amusement, and she saw the stern lines of his face soften into something almost boyish. Little by little, the walls between them crumbled. When she cut her hand peeling potatoes, Boone's calloused fingers were unexpectedly gentle as he bound the wound. When the roof leaked during a storm, Lydia climbed with him to patch it, refusing to be sent inside. "I'm not made of glass," she said firmly, her hair plastered to her cheeks with rain. He only grunted approval, but the pride in his eyes warmed her more than the fire ever could. At night, their companionship deepened in quiet ways. Boone often sat by the fire, whittling wood into small figurines, a habit Lydia had never expected from such a giant of a man. One evening, he set a finished carving on the table, a tiny bird, wings half open. "For you," he said simply. Her throat tightened. She traced the delicate wings with her fingertips, realizing that beneath his silence was a heart capable of tenderness. Outside the cabin, Lydia's presence began to ripple through the community. She carried herbs to sick neighbors, brewed teas that eased fevers, and read aloud from Scripture to children gathered in her kitchen. Her voice, clear and melodic, carried both English and Cherokee words, weaving them together like threads of the same cloth. At first, the townsfolk kept their distance, their prejudice lingering, but slowly respect replaced suspicion. Mrs. Harper, once among the cruelest gossips, pressed Lydia's hand after a healing tea cured her daughter's cough. Children ran up the mountain path, eager for lessons in letters and hymns. Even the blacksmith tipped his hat when he saw her pass through town. Still, the shadow of the railroad stretched closer. Survey stakes crept nearer the creek, and strangers in dark coats watched their land with hungry eyes. Deputy Wade Kettering's visits to town grew more frequent, his voice oily as he spoke of progress and inevitable change. Boone bristled with anger, ready to drive them off with rifle in hand, but Lydia urged restraint. "If we meet them with violence, we become the story they want to tell," she said. "Let them see we are not afraid, but we are just." It was then she revealed the secret her father had entrusted to her, the folded documents hidden carefully in the hem of her wedding veil. On that night, as snow brushed against the windows, she spread the papers across the table, original deeds, sealed with the federal stamp, confirming her family's ownership of the valley and its waters. Boone stared at the fragile parchment, his rough hand hovering as if afraid to break it. "You carried this on our wedding day," he murmured. Lydia nodded. "My father knew men would come to take what was ours. He told me, 'One day this paper will protect not just the land, but your life.'" Boone's eyes burned with fierce pride as he looked at her. She was no longer the bride mocked beneath a veil. She was the woman who held both history and justice in her hands. Together, they vowed to defend their land not only with rifles and fences, but with truth, law, and the strength of their growing bond. The first snowfall of winter blanketed Calico Springs in a deceptive peace, but Lydia and Boone both felt the tension mounting like storm clouds over the valley. The railroad men no longer bothered to hide their intentions. Surveyors hammered stakes deeper into the ground, and Deputy Wade Kettering rode past the cabin more than once, his gaze sharp, his smirk unmistakable. One afternoon, Boone returned from town, jaw set tight, his fists clenched around a folded newspaper. "They're saying the railroad's already purchased rights to the valley," he growled, tossing the paper on the table. "Signed documents. Claimed your father never held title at all." Lydia picked up the paper with trembling hands. The article was full of legal jargon, but the intent was clear. Her name and her father's legacy were being erased. "Forgery," she whispered. "Those documents can't be real." "They don't need real," Boone said grimly. "They just need people to believe." The attacks grew bolder. One night, someone slashed their fence and scattered the cattle. Another evening, Lydia discovered her herb garden trampled, the roots crushed beneath boot heels. At the general store, whispers followed her, cruel reminders of her weight and heritage, now sharpened into accusations. "She's greedy, claiming land that ain't hers." Boone's temper burned like fire. "One more insult, and I'll put my fist through Kettering's teeth," he swore. But Lydia touched his arm, steadying him. "If you fight with fists, they'll call you savage. If I fight with words and truth, they cannot deny me." Her resolve surprised even herself. The girl who once hid behind veils of shame was learning to stand tall, and Boone, for all his size and strength, found her courage the fiercest weapon he had ever seen. Yet even courage wavered in the face of betrayal. One cold morning, a letter arrived from her younger cousin Samuel, who still lived in town. He had once adored her, sitting at her knee while she read him stories. But his words cut like a knife. "Lydia, stop this nonsense. The valley belongs to progress. If you fight, you will be crushed. The company offered me a position in Denver, and I've agreed to testify that you forged your father's deeds. I'm sorry, but I must think of my future." The page blurred in Lydia's hands. Betrayal from family hurt worse than any stranger's scorn. She sank into a chair, her breath ragged. "Even my own blood turns against me," she whispered. Boone crouched before her, his rough hand closing gently over hers. "Then let them all turn. I'll still be here. You're not fighting alone, Lydia." His words steadied her heart more than any sermon could. Still, doubts gnawed at her. Could their papers, fragile and yellowed with age, stand against the polished lies of the railroad's lawyers? Could one Cherokee woman and one mountain man hold back an empire of steel and money? Her fears deepened when Ed Slater, their wary neighbor, knocked on their door one evening. His hat was in his hands, his eyes darting like a hunted man. "I shouldn't be here," he muttered, "but you need to know. Kettering's meeting with the railroad men at the saloon. They plan to raid your home, claim they found counterfeit papers inside, and arrest you both by week's end." The trap was closing. That night, by the fire, Boone spoke of fighting them with rifle and shot. But Lydia laid the veil on the table, the hidden document still tucked within its hem. "This is my weapon," she said quietly. "If I stand in court with these under oath, even Kettering cannot bury the truth." Boone stared into the fire, torn between his instinct to fight with his fists and his respect for her unshakable faith. At last he nodded. "Then we'll walk into their den side by side, but if they lay a hand on you—" His voice darkened. "I swear I'll make them regret it." The stage was set. The railroad had power, lies, and men with guns. Lydia had her father's seal, her voice, and the strength of a husband who would not bend. The next battle would not be fought in the shadows of their cabin, but in the blinding light of a courtroom. The courthouse at Silver Creek was crowded, the air thick with tension. Farmers, townsfolk, and railroad men filled the pews, whispering like wind through dry grass. At the front, Deputy Wade Kettering stood smug beside the attorneys hired by the railroad, a stack of crisp documents laid before them. Boone and Lydia entered hand in hand, their presence drawing stares, some scornful, some sympathetic. "Mrs. Callahan," the lawyer sneered, "you claim this land through a Cherokee line, yet these papers show abandonment. Your father's title expired years ago. This valley belongs to progress, not sentiment." Gasps rippled through the room. Lydia felt every eye upon her, some still filled with ridicule. She tightened her grip on Boone's hand, drew a steady breath, and rose. "You say my father abandoned this land?" she began, her voice calm, carrying across the room. "But he baptized his people by its river. He planted its fields. He raised me beneath its trees. That is not abandonment." The lawyer scoffed. "Sentiment, not law." Slowly, Lydia lifted her wedding veil from her satchel. She spread it across the judge's desk, the fabric trembling in her hands. From its hem, she pulled the folded documents, yellowed, creased, but bearing the unmistakable seal of the federal government. "These are the original deeds," she declared, "signed, sealed, and witnessed by federal officers. My father foresaw the greed that would come, and he hid them where only I could carry them, in the veil I wore the day I was mocked as unworthy. The veil that shielded me became the veil that holds the truth." The judge leaned forward, examining the papers. He struck his gavel once, calling for silence. "These seals are genuine," he announced gravely. "The deeds stand. This land belongs to Mrs. Callahan." The room erupted, some in cheers, others in furious protest. Boone stepped in front of Lydia as Kettering lunged forward, face twisted with rage. "She lies! Those papers are planted!" he shouted. But before he could go further, two federal marshals, summoned quietly by Boone days earlier, stepped from the back of the room. Their badges gleamed in the lantern light. "Deputy Kettering," one announced, "you're under arrest for fraud and conspiracy." Kettering's bravado crumbled. The marshals clasped irons on his wrists as the railroad lawyers gathered their false documents and slunk out, their empire of lies shattered. Lydia stood tall in the chaos, her veil still spread like a banner of victory. Boone looked down at her, pride burning in his eyes. She had not needed his fists or his fury. Her courage, her father's legacy, and the truth had been enough. And for the first time since she had walked into that church, mocked beneath her veil, Lydia felt the laughter of others turn into silence, not of scorn, but of respect. The ride back to Calico Springs was quiet, snow crunching beneath the hooves of their horses. Yet the silence was no longer heavy. It was full, like the hush after a storm when the sun begins to break through. When they crested the ridge and the cabin came into view, Lydia's breath caught. Dozens of neighbors waited there, tools in hand, wagons loaded with timber and nails. Men raised their hats. Women smiled warmly. Children waved. The same community that had once mocked her now gathered to help mend what violence had broken. Boone dismounted first, then turned to lift Lydia gently from her saddle. "They're here for you," he murmured. She shook her head, eyes shining. "No, Boone, they're here for us." That night, the cabin glowed brighter than ever. The fire crackled. The table was full of food brought by neighbors, and laughter mingled with hymns sung in both English and Cherokee. Lydia sat close to Boone, his hand covering hers, their bond no longer hidden or fragile. When the last lanterns dimmed and the last neighbor departed, the two of them sat alone by the fire. Boone studied her, his voice low but steady. "You're safe here, always. This is your home now, if you'll have it." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes, not of sorrow, but of joy. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the warmth of his presence stronger than the fire. For the first time, she felt she belonged, not just to a cabin or a valley, but to a man who had chosen her above all laughter and scorn. Still, as the wind howled outside, a question lingered in the air. Was their love strong enough to stand against the next storm the world might send? From ridicule at the altar to triumph in the courtroom, Lydia and Boone's story reminds us that dignity and love can outlast cruelty and lies. What others mocked became the very strength that held them together. I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Your stories, your thoughts, your voices are what make this journey worthwhile. If you believe, as I do, that love can grow strong even in the harshest places, don't leave just yet. The next tale waiting here may be the one that speaks straight to your heart.